Hey, we've got a repeat sponsor alert. This from the word trepidation, tremulous alarm or agitation, perturbation, as in you've submitted your main manuscript for copy edits, but have to completely rewrite your epilogue. You're feeling trepidation.
To have you just read that to me or share that with me and me receive those words, I felt afraid. I felt like the hair on my arm stood up. There was a little bit of like, oh shit, I actually did that.
So, hey, CNFers, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories, be it narrative journalism, essays, memoir, documentary, film, podcasts, sometimes a little self-help sprinkled in there. We do it all. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Welcome aboard the USS CNF pod today. We welcome Chase Jarvis back to the show. He's the author of Creative Calling, Establish Daily Practice, Infuse Your World with Meaning, and Succeed in Work and Life. Came out a few years ago, and you can listen to our previous podcast about that on episode 169. Good Lord. And now, 5 years later, he's back with Never Play It Safe, a practical guide to freedom, creativity, and a life you love. It's published by Harper Business. But before we get to Chase, I recently attended a Weezer concert where they played the entire Blue Album, among other things. But of course, and of particular interest is when they played Pork and Beans. Here's my bootleg recording, okay? I'ma do the things that I want to. Now, admittedly, it's a bit rough as we dip some of this audio, but this song is significant in that my wife of 14 years now, as of a few weeks ago, we danced to this song at our wedding in 2010. It's a song about not giving a fuck, not answering to anybody but yourself, self-acceptance, and following your own path. To what extent we've accomplished that in our lives and our time together is too depressing to mention, but the themes are, shall we say, apropos. This podcast with Chase because we tackle the ideas of fear, constraints, tension, how success leaves clues, and how bravely he pivoted from the book he wrote to the book that was written. That'll make more sense, I swear, later. Also, how to follow your intuition, how volume matters. And I don't mean loudness, I mean quantity. And that helps inform your intuition. Show notes to this episode and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there you can sign up for the up to 11 Rage. You can see algorithm newsletter, book recommendations, cool links. First of the month, no spam. So far as I can tell, you can't beat it. Now, Chase was the founder of Creative Live, a pioneering online learning platform that he sold a few years ago. He's a world-class photographer and the host of the Chase Jarvis Live podcast. He's at Chase Jarvis on all the socials. He's a force for good and a wildly inspiring person. I've been following him and his work for the better part of 15 years. He's a very prolific contributor to the creative community. And if you visit chasejarvis.com/neverplayitsafe, purchase the book from wherever, and then you'll get a suite of bonuses from Chase himself. Trust me, you'll want to take full advantage of those bonus materials. And at the end of the show, parting shot on the responsibility of platform. But for now, it's time to celebrate Never Play It Safe with the one and only Chase Jarvis. Huh. You know, you write of sort of a quote-unquote chance encounter you had with our mutual acquaintance, Seth Godin.
Yep.
after the acquisition of Creative Live. And that was a kind of a big watershed moment. He saw something amiss with you. And I was hoping that you could take us to that moment, because that was pretty formative in the timeline of the last few years.
Yeah. First of all, Seth is a national treasure, a global treasure, we'll put it that way. And he has this uncanny sense to cut through noise. I think from his own experience of having had some of his companies that he had built acquired, he knows that there's this really interesting and I would just say confusing set of competing feelings and beliefs about the experience that you've just gone through, what you just built is, your identity. There's all sorts of confounding and fascinating reflections that happen in the wake of having, your company that served tens of millions of people, made hundreds of millions of revenue, whether you, for better or worse or good or bad, your identity was very wrapped in, your emotions were tied to, outcomes and to the work. And when that's all of a sudden, somebody else owns that and they can do whatever they want with it, it's a set of conflicting feelings. And Seth knows this, and he picked up on it instantly in me and said, we need to set aside some time. And we were talking about something else, and he's like, now's not the time, but do you have another day later this week? We can like carve out an hour, 30 minutes. And I was like, well, yeah, of course. And I'm thinking, more Seth time is better Seth time for me. So I'm like, yeah, let's chat in a couple days or whatever. I think it was the weekend, maybe. I recounted pretty clearly in the book. And so we come back to this conversation, and he's like, something's off, and I need to just tell you what I have experienced and what I think might be going on. And, it's up to you to fill in the blanks, but, here's what here's some sort of medicine, and I need you to pay attention. And it was, life-changing, life-affirming. And of course, Seth is a laser beam for this stuff. And he's wise beyond measure, and I'm grateful to call him a friend. And he helped me think more clearly about the next chapter. And it was very easy for me to say, after this company, after Creative Live, as the company we're talking about, had been acquired, to celebrate some aspects of it, and of course be sad about others. But it was time. And I wrote that in my letter to my community, that it's like, sometimes these things are bittersweet, and this is just sweet. But it was all too fresh, the bitter or the scared or the, gosh, we sold too soon. Did we, didn't return enough for this investor or that, or, all those questions creep in. It's very easy to be going backwards instead of forwards. And Seth really helped me go forward.
Not that I've had an experience of that nature, but knowing what a key ingredient you were just to the platforming and the public facing nature of Creative Live, and without you there, it feels like an entirely different thing. So I imagine there's a phantom limb component that happened when you extricated yourself completely from it. And, and you have, obviously your podcast and your other ways of public facing, but you were so inextricably tied to that. I imagine that there was a tremendous phantom limb sensation for a while.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you saying that. And I think, it was mutual. Both, I think Creative Live, the community felt that, and I felt that about Creative Live. And yet, I was ready to move on. And the life cycle of having an idea, putting a V1 out into the world, having it be crazy well received. Like, I have never experienced growth like that. We had 50,000 people in our first class. Just start to grok that. And there was no such thing as online learning. That wasn't a thing. There was no platforms. That was like, and 3 months in, we were having 150,000 people in our classes. To have that idea with, my co-founder, to be able to build it, to have an actual thing, and then to have the companies try and buy us, and to have venture capitalists, like the best in the world, not random investors, like the best in the world. They're building sites like, Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot, trying to recruit you to be a part of the thing. Like, that was an amazing journey to grow this with a bunch of, hundreds of highly committed, super passionate, people who worked at Creative Live, and to do that in service of millions of people, tens of millions of people all over the world, make hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, that's a real thing. And then to have that acquired, you can just imagine, just think of how many hundreds of decisions and thousands of hours of blood, sweat, tears, ups, downs had to go into that. And then to have it be over in a moment, like, it's pretty fascinating. And yet, as creators, this is part of our what I feel like our role in culture is to make things, to put them out in the world, to have them be a part of us. And then, in many cases, have them go on to have their own lives. We can never really understand the role or the value that the art that we, and by art, I'm using this in a broad term, right? Whether it's a company, an idea, a product, or whatever, we can never know the outcome that this is going to have or the impact it's going to have on the world. But there's a certain sort of trust. And this goes back to the title of my new book, right? Never Playing It Safe. If you only built things where you knew the outcome, what would you build? It's like, it's almost antithetical. It's laughable when you even say it. And yet so much of our lives, we try and make, safe and shielded and need to know every outcome before we start. And that's just not A, the way life works. And certainly B, didn't match my experience with creative lives. So I'm simultaneously, thrilled, blessed, and there's a component of loss. And the goal is not to never betray ourselves or to never stumble, right? That's where the best stuff in life is, right? It's on the other side of our comfort zone, realizing that we've made a mistake, for example. The goal, and what I wrote this book about, is how to return to yourself over and over again, smarter, faster, kinder, wiser, than before. That's what it means. It's like, I make an analog to meditation. Meditation is not the act of sitting perfectly and only having the exact, nothingness in your mind. Your mind is a machine that's designed to wander. And so meditation is actually the act of bringing a wandering mind back to center, back to the mantra, back to the breath, or whatever your form of meditation is. So this is very similar. And by extension, the goal is to never lose is not to never lose yourself. It's not to never make a mistake. It's not to never be scared. It's actually to do all of those things and return home over and over again and develop that muscle, that trust, that belief that you will right the ship. Like, that's power, man. That is like personal power. It's creative power. It's part of what made me write the book.
Yeah, and there was, roughly 13 months of work on, another version of this book that you entirely scrapped for what became Never Play It Safe. So, take us to that moment of having to essentially abandon such a lot of work to totally pivot.
So I will say, honestly, Brendan, so just as just being totally honest and transparent, like, I have historically, I've been sharing a little bit about the book now that it's out, and, press and interviews and things like this. And I'm usually the one who says those words, right? I, worked on this book for blah, blah, blah. And to have you just read that to me or share that with me and me receive those words, I felt afraid. I felt like the hair on my arm stood up. There was a little bit of like, oh shit, I actually did that. And that, again, just so I'll just go into, 10% more storytelling here. Essentially, when the company had been acquired, I was in a really reflective time, as I just, articulated based on your, the last question that we were working with there. And I have a belief that success leaves clues. And so what about the last chapter of my life did I love? What about it did I not want to participate in anymore? And how can I make my life look more like that, more like the things that worked? And, writing was a piece of that. I love to write, over and over on the topic, like, what do I really want? What do I really want? I journal on that almost every day. One of the things that I came back to was just wanting to be of service to the community that has provided so much for me, and that I feel like the world really gets a lot of value from creators and entrepreneurs and people who are building things. And so I knew that I had a book in there. And so writing every day, that turned into some ideas, and those ideas turned into a conversation with my agent. And they're like, this is awesome. Let's do it. And so I started writing, and there was a 6 month, I'd say 5 or 6 months discovery, 13 months writing, like actively every single day, multiple hours, working with a team of researchers and project managers and writing support and just like all kinds of stuff. And then I found that I was sort of writing what my friend Brene Brown calls gold-plated grit. Like, you talk about gritty, but you're doing a pretty good job of shining it up. Mm-hmm. And it started not feeling good about 6 months into it. And yet the words were pouring out, the words were on paper, and we had, basically essentially an entire book. And then I started feeling sick to my stomach about it. And there was a couple of pivotal moments just about the timing of the book and where I was and what I was thinking about when I would read the book. And sometimes I like to read books aloud to myself, read my own writing aloud, because it's a different way of experiencing it. And I just knew in my heart. And this is there's a whole chapter on this in the book, which I think is so powerful. It's it's a chapter on intuition and how, just like creativity is trained out of us culturally. There's no evil overlord, but the reality is that that's a mass society, needs to, put just people, they need to look like this, walk like this, talk like this. And that is a very negative outcome of large, especially late stage capitalism. That's trained out of us. Our natural state is wildly creative, and our creativity is trained out of us. And the same thing is true with our intuition. Our intuition is one of the most powerful things that we know the least about, and that in trusting it, so many answers unfold before us. And that is another thing that's trained out of us. So when I became aware that, you know what, this is not the book that I'm going to put out, as soon as I sort of knew it in my bones, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unsay it. I couldn't unfeel it. And so in what I still to this day feel like it took a lot of courage. And this is why I don't represent that I'm special or unique. We all feel this fear. And that's what courage is. Courage is feeling this fear and doing it anyway. And so I called up my agent, and he is so smart and kind and thoughtful and talented. And he's like, essentially like, bro, are you sure? And I'm like, I'm sure. And he's just so thoughtful. I can't say enough nice things about Steve. And yet he's like, when I was like, this is how it's going to be. I got it. I'm going to take this ball and I'm going to run with it. This is where I'm going. And I need you to believe in me and trust me. And even if I screw up, the thing that I'm sitting on right now is not the thing. That's not the gold. And I need to be authentic, and I need to do this for myself and for the people that I've been writing this. I write these books and chapters and stories with individual human beings in mind. Like, I wrote this thinking about my wife, and I wrote this thinking about, this particular mentor. And I write, so I'm like, I can't in good conscience put this out. And took it to the publisher with the way I wanted to change it. And they were like, well, there was nothing really to say. I just had to say, thank you. I'll be back. And so in 8 weeks, I essentially rewrote the entire book. Of the 65,000 words, I think probably 60,000 of them are entirely new. And that's a lot. And yet it poured out of me. There was no question as soon as I went to work, that this was the right thing. And it was in the process of doing that I was like, what about this is so valuable that I can't not, talk about it as the title of the book. And it was the risks that I was willing to take, the risks of being, shamed, of not actually delivering, of not showing up, the risk of failure, the fear of success, the fear that I was going to let other people down, that I wouldn't show up with the goods, essentially, and yet doing it anyway. That is where I found essentially the reminder that, oh my God, this is where all of the best stuff in life is. In relationships, it's taking a chance. In, our careers, it's deciding to go for our dream job. And when you start, it manifests in 100 different other ways. How we show up every day, showing up as yourself is so much easier than showing up as a second rate or false version of somebody else. Like, when you realize that all the best stuff is on the other side of our comfort zone, it's so, again, you can't unsee that. And I realized that in that sort of moment, that it is this act of not playing it safe. And to be clear, I say this in the beginning, I'm not talking about seatbelts and sunscreen here. I'm not talking about physical or emotional safety. Those are all, important attributes, but pretty much everything else is, when we play it safe, we are doing ourselves a radical disservice, because the reality is that all sorts of stuff comes up. Mistakes happen. And if mistakes are going to happen either way, either going all in on the things you love and how you want to show up in the world, or somebody else's dream, stuff's going to break and things are going to go wrong. In both those situations, wouldn't you rather have those things go wrong with the authentic you, with the thing that you can fix, that you're put on this earth to come back to yourself time and again? And that is where it just all made sense to me. And I'm like, the title of this book is Never Played Safe.
And I talk to primarily writers all the time. I've been doing it for years, and being a writer myself, oftentimes when you hit kind of a stalling part in a book, sometimes it's just like, okay, well, the honeymoon period of writing it is over, but now you need to power through those messy middles. This
Yep.
gets to your intuition part. You were kind of far along middle of the project when you're like, you decide to jump ship, totally pivot, and write something entirely different. How did you make the determination that it was you needed to totally try something new versus just pushing through that Pressfieldian resistance that you're going to run into in the middle?
Yep, it's a great question. And this is, as you said, it's the reliance and the understanding, the belief in our intuition. And this is the goal of being a creator. And this is why volume of work matters. Because early on in your career, distinguishing between those two things is more difficult.
Right.
But when you put out so much work in so many different creative disciplines, I've made television shows and movies and short videos and books and companies, and I've just been a builder my whole life. You start to the more, it's sort of like the more you do, the more you know what you sound like when you're at your best and when you're at your truest. And so volume matters. And I believe that it is difficult to distinguish those things early on. Doesn't mean you should attack it any less, right? You should still listen to that intuition, but it's just the process of honing it like a muscle, right? Like it's like anything. The more you use it, the more you build it. And in building your ability to listen to your intuition, to know it from a crock of shit, or to know it from resistance, or to know it from any of the other blockers that come up in any creative endeavor, in any building, certainly in writing, you start to become aware of what's real and what's not real. And to me, fortunately, I've had a lifetime of building stuff. So a lifetime really of developing that muscle. It's not to say it doesn't let me down. It's not to say there's times that I bump into things that are too strong, or I overcome, or I succumb to resistance, to use Stephen Pressfield's term from The War of Art. And yet in this moment, I knew because of a commitment to this process. And the cool thing is this is absolutely something you can extrapolate to every area of life. Like, this is a book about life and how to live it. It's about creativity, but it's also about fear, right? So you can apply the understanding of the fear that goes through, and it's like, how do I trust my intuition? I mean, that voice in our head, and it's applicable to anything, anytime you have fear in your life. And if anybody out there is like me, or like, if you're human, for God's sakes, like, that's a part of it, right? It's by design. And yet, to understand that all the best stuff in life is on the other side of our fears, how do we hone that muscle of intuition? And the answer is repetition, trust, belief, being willing to fail. I have a whole chapter on failure. I have a whole chapter on building practices, the muscle essentially that it is that we're talking about. That's by design. So the answer is an unpleasant one. It's that repetition is the skill that we're breeding here. There's not some other skill. It's just literally the repetition of listening, being quiet, still enough to hear, and then believing the thing that you're hearing is truth, and going towards your truth. So applicable. It's applicable, very applicable to the creators and the writers in your community, for example. And yet the same thing is true to dating, to relationships, to financial decisions, to everything. And that's, again, what I love about this book, is it's sort of so focused and so applicable at the same time. That's why I feel like I stumbled on a gem in writing it.
Now, having read Creative Calling and then in the sequence reading Never Play It Safe, to me, it Never Play It Safe, it read more like not necessarily a sequel, but kind of a prequel. And you talk
interesting, right? Yeah,
that's kind of how I viewed it. It seemed, but I wonder for you how they play off each other and how you see them in relationship to each other.
I think you freaking nailed it, Brennan. And I feel like I can say that because your audience can grok this and can follow it. It does feel like a prequel, and yet if I zoom out far enough, essentially Creative Calling is about the fact that we are all creative, and it toys very much with the in what ways are we creative, and how are we creative, and who told us I was and wasn't, and what does that mean now that I know I have creativity? What can I do? so it's like a zoomed in on creativity. I'll call that just sort of the small C. And this book is about creativity, the capital C, that the most important thing that we do, we will create our lives. And our lives are, to be absolutely crystal clear, they are created, right? The people who you look up to, admire, and appreciate, there's all kinds of things. They had privileges and advantages and disadvantages, and all those things are true. And it's the most, wild, untamed creative act that we can do as a human is actually build our life. So in the ways that it is a prequel, you have to be alive and be building a life in order to, to be able to recognize and reconcile with your own creativity. So in that way, it's a precursor, right? We're building our lives and we know that we're building our lives. And then it's a follow on because it's a bigger version of creativity. It's an expanded version. We're creating our life. And this is the most potent, urgent, and important task before us, is to realize sort of two things. One, we are driving and we can choose to hold onto the wheel or not. And if you do choose to hold on the wheel, that's fantastic. And the fact that you are driving means that you get to decide where you go. And it's not perfect. It's not linear, but that is power. That's personal power. And, to me, it is such a blessing. And it's not that it's not going to be full of pitfalls and mistakes and errors and things that you want to retrace. But as I mentioned earlier, this is sort of where I get really clear on the book. It's not about not making mistakes. It's about recovering quickly. It's not about not betraying yourself. I went through innumerable versions of how I betrayed myself in this book. At some point I was like, wait a minute, I'm still freaking here. I'm still standing. So I betrayed myself all these times. Sometimes that led to hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt. It allowed to toxic relationships. It allowed to, failed companies or, botched projects. And yet here I am. And so the goal is to actually get okay with that, to realize that that's actually the process working, and to return to yourself time and time again. So to me, that's the way that this is a more universal message, right? The creators that pick this book up, it will automatically read to you like a creative book. And for the people who don't identify as creators, I think you will find that, oh my gosh, I am wildly creative because I'm creating the canvas, the tapestry that is my life. And I can choose to grab onto the wheel if I return to all these tools that are natively, naturally available to me. Like I can steer the ship where I want to.
When I was in high school, I had what was called the Omera Mart, and I bought a bunch of I would get cubes of soda and like candy bars in bulk, and I would bring them into my locker. I had a couple coolers in my locker, and people would come to me, and I would literally sell, cans of soda and candy out of my locker for a while. And as soon as the teachers got wind of this, they shut that shit down quick, and I reopened again, and they shut it down again. And what always killed me was like, okay, I understand that maybe selling stuff on school property might not be within the rules, but what I wish someone would have done, and I imagine there are hundreds of well-meaning teachers across the country who do this as well, that someone should have said, like, I understand, it looks like you have an entrepreneurial spirit. You can't do this, but let's try to cultivate it elsewhere. And you similarly had you were selling comics, doing comedy magic shows, and teachers when you were growing up kind of squashed that as well. And it's like, what would you tell people who have been, similarly squashed to then maybe, as you say yourself, go find yourself again, to maybe resurface from such rejection from the powers that be?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, Brendan. The story that I like to tell is about my second grade teacher, Miss Kelly, and not dissimilar to you selling, concessions out of your car or out of your locker. Rather, that was how I made my first film profitable. It was certainly I sold tickets to the screening when I was between first and second grade, but we also sold candy and soda and whatnot and screened it to the whole neighborhood. And we made a profitable film when I was like 7 years old. And I'm proud of that. And that's why I rolled into second grade, like on fire, like, yo, I'm this creative guy. I was doing a weekly comic strip that I was selling for exactly the price of milk at lunch. So you could decide to like, I'm going to have my lunch, but for the price of milk, I'm going to read Chase's comic and I'm just going to skip milk that one day or whatever. I think your point about like, can't we recognize and harness that? Absolutely. And yet this is what's so confusing as a young person. And I'll actually extend that. I'm going to say as a person, like we get messages from the world, from culture, and ironically and sadly and confusingly, a lot of times we get messages from people we respect and appreciate and love and care for, our parents, our career counselors, our teachers, our grandparents, that saying you should do this. And yet it's actually our job to try and reconcile the fact that they aren't living our lives. And it's up to us to be the author of our own script. And so this is why so many people get, bogged down and get dragged back into the role of playing it safe, right? And doing the things that other people who have our best intentions in mind, but can't actually live our lives for us. That's why that's confusing. So I do, like you, I wish that more adults were able to recognize this in their kids, and that the sweet twist is that the companies, for example, the creators that actually understand this and recognize it and can find a way to channel it, like Steve Jobs was very articulate. He said, I don't decide what we're going to do and then hire smart people to go do it. I hire smart people and have them tell us what we're supposed to do. It's like, that's a different mindset, right? Than I know best, or than we know best. And I think it's true. It's like, only the person knows best for themselves. And it's also true that we don't know these things early on. And yet it is our job in life to find things that light us up, to experiment enough, to play. Like I have a whole chapter on play, about how that is actually the engine for life. And the things that you loved doing as a kid, they leave clues, right? Success leaves clues. My quote from my friend James Victory comes to mind: amazing artist hangs in the MoMA. The thing that made you weird as a kid is the thing that can make you great today. It's like that. We have all this wisdom inside of us. Go back to the intuition bit, and it's our job to listen to that in the face of being misunderstood from all the adults and career counselors and people who mean well for us. It's not an easy task, and yet I would absolutely welcome. And I think society does reward the people, the places that actually can see and think like that. And it might as well be you, right? Why don't you lean into that? Be that parent, be that leader, be that person for yourself.
You structure the book into 7 major chapters, what you call levers. And, you've got attention, time, intuition, which we've riffed on quite a bit, constraints, play, failure, and practice. So when you were thinking of structuring this book, how did those come to mind, and how did you see them feeding into one another?
That was, to me, the simultaneously the most important and the slowest, most difficult part of the book, is deciding what to write about and what not to write about, right?
Yeah.
And this, ironically, there's a chapter in there about constraints, which you mentioned, and I feel like, from practice writing and from writing, early versions, and from working on this stuff, that what a good chapter length felt like, how many stories ought to be in there, and what basically, it's like I knew some notes. I had a rhythm in mind. I knew a few chords, and then I started sort of extrapolating, like, okay, so what's a good song sound like? And I started combining those notes and chords and melodies in different ways, and to use it, to lean into the musical analogy here. And it was a very slow process, and yet clarity emerged the more time I tried to combine the notes, and the more times I tried to play the song, and things were combined, things were outright cut. And it is a very, very valuable experience to go through and to cut, right? How do you put the stuff that's on the cutting room floor? I feel like the stuff that's on the cutting room floor for this book would be a great book.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, being ruthless in the editing part, I didn't want a 500-page book, and I wanted it to be focused. And then when I started really thinking about this through the lens of, I want everything in this book, all of the major themes, the major headings that you just, named 7 of them, for example, as chapter titles, the tools that I call them, levers. I want all of them to have something in common, which is that they are natively thriving inside of us. That is our natural state. Our natural state is that we know how to direct our attention. We know how to pay attention. We know that deep inside that we should listen to that voice in our head that tells us what we should and shouldn't do, who we should and shouldn't be friends with, what we ought to do or not do with our time or energy. We know that failure, like I don't know anyone who has an able-bodied child that says, okay, the 27th time my kid stumbles, I guess we're just going to consider she's not a walker.
Right.
You know what? No one says that.
Right.
And yet, if you told me you tried a business idea 27 times and it failed again, most people in the world would tell you to stop on that idea. It needed to be true that all of these levers, each of these chapters, were something that we all experienced. There was sort of the specificity and this universality of each of them. And that cut a lot of the other ideas, frankly, because each of those, the levers for life, each of these chapters are very clearly things that we are very in tune with. We know natively, and yet they're conditioned out of us. We're conditioned to get numb around our attention. Just think about how distracted our culture is and how many things are competing for our attention. And yet the ability to direct our attention, to choose what you focus on, literally equals the experience of your life. In the book, I go into the narrative about Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, about time in the concentration camps, what he was able to focus on in that time versus what so many other victims, who didn't have the ability to train their attention on the right things. They had a completely different experience of that horror. And so if you start to realize that, wow, attention is completely universal. We all have it. We all decide to get it or give it or pay it or direct it. And that is our experience of our life. Wow, that's a universal. I mentioned we already have countless times in 35 minutes that we've been going, right? That intuition, we all have it. And yet culture or parents or just society at large teaches us to, we should play it safe instead of taking the risk. We should, ignore our intuition and look for all these outside validations on who we ought to be or what we can become. There's a concept called mimesis. French philosopher René Girard. Girard talks about mimesis as it's this really risky thing because as social animals, we essentially just mimic what we see out in the world. We see a person who, I become a YouTuber, so okay, I can become a YouTuber, and they do it like this, so I can do it like that. And it's a powerful vector for learning. And yet, if we're only mimicking what we see, it sort of limits us artificially for what's possible. Ultimately, all of these things are native inside us, all of the chapters. And that was a major cutting point in the book. These are in and these are out. And to me, it's just a really tidy package. It's all learnable, knowable. We have experience with it. We relate to it. And for that, I think that's part of what's so powerful, right? It's hiding in plain sight, and it's our job just to excavate this stuff. And it doesn't take, some of these things are instantaneous. It's just your awareness of them, and you can turn them on like a light switch, and your life is different tomorrow. It's not like you have to go study in a monastery, in Bhutan or whatever for, 30 years to have this. You can have it tomorrow, today, in this minute, for example.
What I like about the structure of the book, and then you bringing up these very universal themes that are, in fact, quite normal in creative spheres. To me, it's very much like when, it might not be so much true in baseball anymore, but with batting average, like we know a 300 batting
Sure.
average is a great batting average, 70% failure rate, and you're a Hall of Famer.
Yep.
Knowing that, you have a baseline of what is good and acceptable. And so, I traffic in journalism circles. So like if we're cold querying editors, if you're hitting on like 10% of your queries, like you're kind of killing it. But if
Yep.
you don't know the batting averages, everything just feels terrible. And so
Yeah.
and
It's
so
so true.
yeah, and so it's like by you laying out very fundamental themes, like, oh, it's normal to feel like this. Oh, it's these perceived constraints, these constraints we put on ourselves. Like, this is kind of normal self-talk. Okay, once we recognize that, then we have a better idea of how to proceed once we know what's normal. But if you don't know what the
Yep.
baseline is, you're just thrashing in the water, and then you fatigue and often give up.
Brendan, you are like, this is a laser beam on your part. You are cutting right to this is a core piece of the book that didn't exist in previous versions in any sort of manifestation. It was like, wait a minute. I need to, like, this is a personal journey, and I need to realize all the times that I got it wrong. And in telling some of those stories and the stories of there's so many great stories in the book. Some of people, very, very famous people who are I'm dear friends with. So I know the inside baseball parts of this and parts of just, ordinary people who have created extraordinary outcomes. It's, combination of, my experiences and those that I just described. It's like when you start to see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Like, oh God, this is how it works. This
Yeah.
is what a batting average looks like, for example. And to me, it's those stories that actually make this book so relatable. And this is why I'm really proud of it, because it's easy to write a book about all the things you should do and to not, show the tough underbelly. I think it makes for a more interesting read. And there's some sort of a connection, a relatability that is like, okay. If I know the 10% hit rate on pitched queries is great, or I know, hitting 3 out of every 10 at bats is like a world class. If I know that even Sir Richard Branson and Maya Angelou and Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday and Rachel Rogers, any of these people that, oh God, they're all doing the same stuff. Chase stumbled and Chase burned hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of his life doing something that he wasn't supposed to be doing, and he knew it. Oh, I feel seen.
Yeah.
So, kudos to you for realizing that. And that is a very intentional attribute of the book.
And one of the many parts of the book that really resonated with me, of particular note, was constraints, but perceived constraints and negative self-talk and stuff of that nature. And there's one passage that like really, 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 hit home, where you write, like, imagine you have a great idea, but before you even think about sharing it with other people or trying to make something of it, you shut yourself down. I don't have time. I'm not the right person. Maybe it's not. And this is the thing for me. Maybe it's not such a great idea after all. Who am I to think I could pull this off? I say that all the time. And that one really struck a chord with me. And for people who similarly think about that, like, oh, I might write this book, but you know what? Someone better is probably going to write it. If I have the idea, and gosh, if I'm thinking of it, 16 other people have already thought about it and cast it off. It's like, how can people, get away and maybe get beyond that degree of self-talk so they can at least experience, at least reach the point of failure at the worst.
Yeah. Whew. So the constraints chapter is very powerful. I think you're right in that one. And yet I'm also going to lean on the last chapter of the book, which is around practice. And if you are not what you do, then what are you? You don't get a lot of credit in this life for thinking the right things. It's like, oh, I had a present for you that I never gave you. It's like, it doesn't count, right?
Yeah.
So it's what we do that matters, and therefore our practices. So you can actually, my goal with sharing that bit in constraints is that, hey, let's normalize this. Everybody thinks this way. And here's some great stories of people who played through that. And you know what? Those people are a lot like you. Those people are a lot like me and everyone else who's reading this book and looking at each other, pretending we got it all figured out. And you know what? They had a practice, and the practice was recognizing that this is happening and playing through anyway. That's the playing it safe. You don't get talked in to playing it safe, because, one thing I know about that is most of the people who are talking you out of living your dreams are people who gave up on theirs. once you see that, again, it's like there's a lot of things that you can't unsee once you've seen them. And so, I wrap up the book with a great, all the great ways to practice, because if we are what we do, there's reasons why they call it a meditation practice, because you never meditate perfectly, right?
Yeah.
Life doesn't unfold perfectly. And if we think of it all as practice and trying to get 1% better, that all of a sudden relieves us of this fiction of a perfect life. It's not about trying to create a perfect life. It's about how to live your life. And this is the, returning time and time again to yourself, and the practice of recognizing that voice in your head is normal. And we'd like to make it less normal. We'd like to play through that. Just know that it's there, and that all these other people, famous people, ordinary people, we've all had it. They all played through it, and I can too. That's sort of the message. And again, this is why I hinted earlier at you're really spot on to recognize that about that attribute of the book. Not only does it, highlight this false narrative that we've all been buying into, but there's a roadmap out of it, which I would say is, again, part of maybe my favorite part of the book. And that's the bit that I came up with in my 11th hour. Like, oh God, I hate business books that say, oh, do smart thing A and smart thing B and smart thing C, and then you're going to have this great business and everything's going to be perfect and you're going to go out and live happily ever after. I like things that are like, one of my favorite business books of all time is one called The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And when I read that, when it came out originally, I was in the middle of building Creative Live. And it's not like build perfect thing A, perfect thing B, test your product, go to market, blah, blah, blah. Don't you have a great product now? I think the chapters are like how to fire your best friend, how to tell your investors you're out of money, it's just like horror story after horror story. And yet that's the stuff that resonates and actually teaches us something. So, I want to make a practice out of that, lay bare this, the bullshit that we've been taught to buy into, realize that we're all in this together. And, the way over around, whatever past us material is through. And here's the blueprint.
There's also another, a line in the book that that was particularly poignant, or at least it was an observation that I think speaks to this particular time in particular. And you write that our misunderstandings about failure seem to be at an all-time high and rising. And I think I have an answer to that just from my own intuition. But I wonder why you feel like that maybe these misunderstandings about failure are at an all-time high these days.
One way is specifically because information moves at a rate that it's never moved before. It's like infinitely faster. And what we see is all day, every day, instantly millions of versions of the perfect execution of anything. You can pick up, open Instagram, any social media platform, scroll to the perfect execution of any activity. And yet, our wiring, our neurology, our multi-million-year-old sort of developed humanity, the only way we used to get to see that was growing up in a small tribe where we saw others try and ride the bike and fall 100 times and then start to ride it okay, and then get better at it, and then slightly better, and then way better, and then, oh man, of course this is why Sandra is the best bike rider, is because she's been doing it since she was 5, and I got to see that whole journey. So that's sort of our DNA, our wiring, our neurology, our biology. And that is exactly the opposite of what we get today. We see volume 11, perfect execution of everything.
Yeah.
So, this is why there's this gap in understanding of, it's at an all-time high and rising, specifically in my mind.
Yeah, and I think there's another point that's worth underscoring, and it kind of piggybacks off of what social media feeds us. Is the quiet hero of this book is your wife Kate, and there's a moment where she asks you, what's enough? And not a lot of us, even with small little podcast audiences or gigantic audiences or small businesses or gigantic businesses, very few people stop to ask that question. Maybe what I have is enough. What if I just double down on the people who are already here and get the joke? And it is really one of the more important questions any of us can meditate on, no matter how big our audience is or how much money we make or whatever. Yeah. How did that question, and why did that question hit you so hard at that moment?
It totally rocked me. Yeah. It totally rocked me. And I'll leave all the details for the reader in the book. But the shortest version I can hint at is I had just gotten off stage, shared the stage with Lady Gaga. I was an ambassador for Polaroid. She was the celebrity side. I was the photographer. And we were relaunching the brand in New York. And I just come off a bunch of victories. People were trying to buy Creative Live. I was, doing private jet trips all over the world. And I was just like, this is an 11 out of 10. This is making it. I just got off that stage with Lady Gaga. I was in Vegas, got out of the shower. And when Kate pops this question, she's like, what? And she's basically like, this is out of control. As you said, my wife, Kate, she is the silent hero of this book. And it's like her ability to ask and in the most heartfelt, kind way. That's part of why it's such a laser beam is like, is this what you desired when you started doing this, or has this become what you desired? Because I know you really well, and it seems like it's out of whack. I talk at length about it in the book, and I think the story is better written than I'm articulating it here. And yet it immediately caused me to like, oh my, you can be, off track by just a degree. And if you walk 100 miles, you're really far from home. And that's what I had come to understand in that moment. And as you're right, we all need to ask ourselves that question. That's one of the reasons why I journal on this question almost every day. Like, what do I really want? So I can, keep my compass attuned to true north.
And I think a good way to maybe bring our conversation down for a landing is actually going all the way back to basically the epigraph of the book, this quote by Helen Keller, which is, "Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing." So when did that quote hit your eye, and why did that become such a North Star for this book for you?
It was partway through.
Mm-hmm.
And it was when I had, a friend of mine, Charlie, shared it with me. And because I had shared the book with him, the topic, and I was, basically I turned it in, the manuscript had been accepted, and I was, working as we writers do on all manner of, making it tighter and better and cutting and all that stuff. And it's just like, God, she basically has captured in a phrase like the thing that I've been chasing for my whole life. And it's so strange to not know it and then stumble on it. And yet it can be simultaneously so simple. What is it? Simple but not easy, as the saying goes.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I love about that. It's simple but not easy. And that's why I've tried to provide, the subhead of this book it's called Never Play It Safe, but the subhead is a practical guide to freedom, creativity, and a life you love. And I really tried to over-index on the practical part. It was really guided by this notion that hard stuff's going to happen in life, and this idea of safety. If you make a safe choice, there are just as many pitfalls in the safe choice as there are what you perceive to be the risky choice. So given that there's the same number of downfalls, like, why not go for it? Why not go for the thing you truly love and want to be or become in this world? Anything else is a disservice to this one precious life.
Well, fantastic. That's a wonderful place to bring our conversation down for a landing, Chase. And so just as always, just thanks for, I've kind of been attuned to what you've been up to for the better part of 15 years. And it's been great to see just everything you're up to in service of the creative community at large. So I just want to, thank you for the work you've done and for carving out an hour to talk some shop here and celebrate this wonderful book of yours.
Man, I really appreciate you saying that, bud. And you're a fantastic conversation and interviewer, and I appreciate the way that you show up. You do a great job showing up for your community, and it's a treat to be a guest on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yes, awesome. Thanks to Chase for coming back on the show. This pod was one of his very first recorded interviews, and it was recorded several weeks ago. And he asked for the raw tape of this podcast afterwards so he could better improve his messaging around the book. I thought he did a wonderful job, but That's him. He's iterating. He's looking to improve. I dig it. As someone who can stand to improve some, it's inspiring. Thanks for listening this far, Singing Effers, and consider subscribing to the podcast by smashing whatever subscribe button is on your preferred podcast app, or not. It's up to you. That's the beauty of podcasts. I'm in a position where I'm thinking about the public-facing component of writing this Prefontaine book, or finishing this Prefontaine book. I'm at the point where I hate the book enough to know it's done. Like, fuck this book. Like, hate it. It's an asshole. Go away. Shoo. Go. A big part of me doesn't want to engage in the forward-facing shit I see hundreds of authors do on a daily basis. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to consume it, let alone perform it. On some level, it's just sad how we're all clamoring for the finite attention of others, trying to peel off another sliver of someone else's attention for to sell something, to get someone to read something, to subscribe to a newsletter. Like the Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, everyone on some level is treating their lives like they're a reality show. Book cover reveals, box cuttings, box openings, here's all my events, and wow, look at all the panels I'm on at AWP, and here's yet another New York Times column I wrote, and did I mention the Washington Post published another essay? I guess I hate the hustle. I hate the posturing. I hate the one-upping. I hate the flaunting of status. I hate the posting of messy desks, and I love the posting of messy desks. I don't want to engage in the hustle. When I was younger, my sister told me I never had to, this regarding athletics, that I didn't have to tell anyone I was good. If I was good at something, people would notice. There's flaws to that logic. Sure, you have to be good, but at some point there has to be some self-advocacy or advocacy from others to put you in a position to better leverage your talent. So in any case, I have sort of this inception idea that if you're good enough, the cream rises to the top. If the book is good enough, it should spread hand to hand on its own merit. That I don't want to post about it and nauseate people. It makes me nauseous. I can't imagine what it makes you feel like. Well, what can I do? Well, I'll talk about it here. It's what I do. I've been doing it for a year and a fucking half already. Longer if you go back to the book proposal journey. But here's the thing. This is the whole point of this parting shot. At some point, it actually becomes selfish to hide. When you've built a stage and built some degree of platform, there are scores of people who bring a book to life. There are scores of people who would kill for the opportunity I have with the publisher I have, with the editor who acquired my book, for the agent who sold it on my behalf. Mainly it's a disservice to the community and an insult to the community if I don't leverage every asset I'm privileged enough to have earned. To what extent I've earned any of it, I don't know. But I have a certain measure of privilege, a ton of it actually. And it would be selfish not to wield it for the greater good. It's like the scene from Good Will Hunting where Matt Damon's character leaning up against Ben Affleck's truck and they're just kind of smoking cigarettes, hanging out in Matt Damon's character. He's saying how he doesn't plan on leaving. He's going to hang around with his townies and all that. And his friend, played by Ben Affleck, tells Matt Damon's character that he's sitting on a winning lottery ticket and he's too big a pussy to cash it in. And what gets me about the scene is when Ben's character says this, and Matt Damon is sick of hearing how he's like, I owe it to myself. I'm tired of this, blah, blah, blah. And what drives the point home and the real gut punch of it all is Ben Affleck's character saying with real incisive anger, he's like, no, fuck you. You don't owe it to yourself. You owe it to me. So there's an army of people I owe this book to. And the most important one was the one I danced with to Pork and Beans 14 fucking years ago. So yeah, I'll be hustling. I don't owe it to myself. This game stopped being about me a long time ago. I owe it to you. I owe it to her. I owe it to my editor. I owe it to my agent. I owe it to my dementia-addled mother. I owe it to my sister. I owe it to my father and my stepmother, to the 12-legged beast and Hank, Kevin, and Lachlan, so you'll excuse the hustle. And if you can do, interview. See ya.